Her ex took everything in the divorce, but forgot the threshing barn her father hid in her name. What she found inside wasn't just a second chance. It was the truth that would finally set her free. If you've ever had to start over from nothing, I think this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, and let's walk this road together. The key turned in the lock for the last time. It wasn't a dramatic sound, not the cinematic click you'd expect to punctuate the end of a life. It was small, tired, a metallic sigh of resignation. I stood on the porch of the house I had helped design, the house where I'd planted the climbing roses that now clung to the siding like stubborn memories. My house. Except it wasn't. Not anymore. According to a stack of papers thick enough to stop a door, signed in triplicate with ink that was still slightly tacky, it was Mark's house now. Everything inside was Mark's. The Danish teak furniture we'd picked out together, the art we'd bought on our honeymoon in Santa Fe, even the dog, a golden retriever named Gus who was currently whining on the other side of the door, his tail thumping a confused, mournful rhythm against the wood. That was the part that felt like a physical blow, a theft of loyalty and love that a court order couldn't possibly quantify. My lawyer, a woman with a kind face and eyes that had seen too many stories like mine, had called it a total asset liquidation in his favor, a clean slate, she'd said, trying to frame it as a positive. But it didn't feel clean. It felt like an erasure. 2 years of my life, my income, my inheritance from my mother, all of it had been funneled into what Mark called our joint enterprise, a vague and glossy term for his failing tech startup. And when it failed, the debt, somehow, became entirely mine to absorb in the abstract, while the assets, the tangible things you could touch and see and live in, became entirely his to keep. It was a masterful piece of legal maneuvering, a sleight of hand so brilliant I could almost admire it if it hadn't left me standing on a porch with a single cardboard box at my feet. The box contained the only things his lawyer couldn't argue had been commingled, a shoebox of old photos of my parents. My father's tarnished silver pocket watch that didn't run. A stack of worn paperbacks. My college diploma. It was the wreckage of a life, the few artifacts that proved I had existed before Mark. I looked at the box, then back at the gleaming windows of the house. I could see my reflection, a pale, blurry ghost haunting the edges of someone else's perfect life. A part of me wanted to scream, to throw a rock through the pristine bay window, to do something that would leave a mark. But I was too tired. The fight had been bled out of me over months of depositions and mediations, of watching the man I had loved transform into a cool, efficient stranger who spoke of our life together in terms of depreciation and market value. I picked up the box. It was heavier than it looked. I walked down the bluestone path, each step an act of finality. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I got into my car, a 10-year-old sedan that had been deemed of insufficient value to be included in the asset division. A small mercy. I put the box on the passenger's seat, a silent companion for the journey to nowhere. I was 28 years old, and my net worth was a cardboard box and a depreciating vehicle. I was staying on a friend's couch, a temporary arrangement that already felt like an imposition. I drove away from the manicured lawn and the climbing roses, and for the first time in a year, I felt absolutely nothing. It was a terrifying, hollow peace. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape so barren there was nothing left to feel. For 3 weeks, I lived in that strange, suspended numbness. I went through the motions. I searched for jobs online, my impressive resume feeling like a document from another person's life. I went for long, aimless walks through unfamiliar neighborhoods. I ate cheap takeout and watched the dust motes dance in the slivers of sunlight in my friend Sarah's spare room. She was kind, endlessly patient, but her sympathy was a constant reminder of how far I'd fallen. I was a project, a refugee. Every "how are you doing?" felt like a test I didn't know how to answer. Fine was a lie. My life has been systematically dismantled by a man I once promised to love forever, was a conversation stopper. So I just nodded and said, "Getting there." The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was tucked into a small stack of mail Sarah had left for me on the coffee table, mostly junk mail and final bills forwarded from my old address. But this one was different. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with the embossed letterhead of a law firm I'd never heard of, Gable and Sons, attorneys at law. The postmark was from a town I barely recognized, a place called Oakhaven, somewhere in the rural part of the state I hadn't visited since I was a child. I turned it over in my hands. It was addressed to me, Alara Vance. My maiden name, a name I hadn't used in years, a ghost from a past I felt increasingly disconnected from. My first thought was that it was a mistake. Or worse, another creditor Mark's lawyers had unearthed, another ghost of a debt come to haunt me. My stomach tightened. I almost threw it away, but my curiosity, a faint, flickering pilot light in the darkness of my apathy, got the better of me. I slid it open with my thumbnail. The paper inside was just as heavy, the typewritten words crisp and formal. It was from a man named Arthur Gable, senior partner. He wrote that he had been the executor of my father's estate. My father, Daniel Vance, had passed away 5 years ago, a sudden heart attack that had ripped the world out from under me. It had been just the two of us since my mom died when I was 10. His death had been the first great fissure in my life, the one that had, in retrospect, made the crack for Mark to slip into. Mr. Gable explained that while the primary estate had been settled years ago, a small life insurance policy that had paid for his funeral and left me with a modest inheritance, the very inheritance I had later invested in Mark's joint enterprise, there was a small, overlooked addendum. A piece of property. He used specific legal language. A parcel of land designated Lot 7B, including a single outbuilding, specifically a threshing barn, located at 14 Sparrow Creek Road, Oakhaven. He was writing to inform me that under the terms of a trust my father had established, full ownership of this property had automatically transferred to me on my 20th birthday, which had been 2 months prior. The deed was being held in his office. He concluded by saying he understood this might come as a surprise and invited me to call him at my earliest convenience to discuss the disposition of the asset. I read the letter 3 times. A barn. A threshing barn. The words felt foreign, archaic. I had a vague, sepia-toned memory of visiting my grandparents' farm as a little girl before they passed away and the land was sold off. I remembered the smell of hay and dust and the sheer, cathedral-like scale of the barn, sunlight streaming through the gaps in the siding like lasers. But that was their farm long gone. This was something else, something my father had bought and hidden and left for me. Why? My dad was a high school history teacher, a man of books and quiet contemplation. He wasn't a farmer. He wasn't a land baron. He was a man who, I now realized, I knew less than I thought. The questions began to bubble up, pushing through the numbness. Why had he never told me? Why set it up to transfer on my 20th birthday? And why a barn of all things? It made no sense. For the first time in weeks, a feeling other than grief or emptiness began to stir. It was confusion, yes, but it was laced with something else. A flicker of intrigue, a forgotten property, an inheritance I knew nothing about. It was a loose thread in the tightly woven narrative of my failure, and I felt an undeniable, irrational urge to pull on it. I called the number at the bottom of the letter. A calm, elderly voice answered on the second ring. Gable and Sons. I introduced myself, my voice raspy from disuse. Mr. Gable remembered my father well. A good man, your dad, he said, his voice warm and genuine. A thoughtful man. He came to see me about this almost 10 years ago. He was very specific about the terms. He explained that the property taxes had been prepaid out of a small fund my father had set aside for that exact purpose. The fund was now depleted, and the next tax bill was due in a few months. He wanted it to be a safety net for you, Alara, Mr. Gable said gently. He said, a person needs a place to stand, Arthur. A place that's theirs, no matter what. A place to stand. The words echoed in the empty space of my life. I had no place to stand. I had a couch. I asked him about the property, what he knew. He said it was old, likely derelict. Part of the original Vance family homestead that my dad had quietly bought back after my grandparents died, a piece the developers who bought the main farm hadn't wanted. It was isolated, set back from the road, and hadn't been used in decades. Most people would just sell the land, he advised, his tone shifting from reminiscent to practical. Land out here has some value, especially now. Developers are always sniffing around. It could be a nice little nest egg, a way to get back on your feet. He was right, of course. It was the logical thing to do. Sell it. Take the money and get a small apartment. Start rebuilding. It was the sensible path. But as he spoke, I saw the house with the climbing roses. I saw Mark's cool, triumphant smile in the mediator's office. I had played the sensible game, and I had lost everything. The idea of taking this one strange, nonsensical thing my father had left me and turning it into cash felt like another kind of surrender. It felt like letting Mark's world, the world of assets and liquidation, win again. I'd like to see it, I said, the words surprising me as much as they probably surprised him. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Of course, Mr. Gable said, his voice carefully neutral. The deed and the keys are here for you whenever you're ready. After I hung up, I stood in the middle of Sarah's living room, the letter clutched in my hand. Oakhaven was a 3-hour drive, a journey into a past I barely remembered, to a place I didn't know existed, left to me by a man I was beginning to realize I hadn't truly known. It was insane. It was impractical. It was the first thing that had felt like my own choice in a very long time. I went into the spare room and started packing my cardboard box back into my car. I didn't know what I was looking for, but for the first time, I felt like I was moving toward something instead of just running away. The drive to Oakhaven was a slow transition from one world to another. The city's dense, angry skyline gradually gave way to sprawling suburbs, which in turn melted into the rolling, forgotten farmland of the state's interior. The highways narrowed, the concrete and steel replaced by asphalt roads cracked with weeds and lined with ancient, stooping oak trees. It was the landscape of my childhood summers, a place I hadn't seen since my father's funeral. I'd fled from it then, from the suffocating kindness of small-town people who all seemed to know a story about me I'd long forgotten. I had run toward the anonymous promise of the city, toward a life I thought was bigger, better, toward Mark. Now I was driving back, a refugee from that bigger life. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. I kept the windows down, letting the air, thick with the smell of damp earth and cut grass, fill the car. It was a smell I associated with my father. He'd always had dirt under his fingernails from his vegetable garden, a small patch of rebellion in our suburban backyard. He'd loved the land, even if he only had 1/10 of an acre of it. He tried to teach me the names of the trees, the calls of the birds, but I'd been a teenager, more interested in my phone than in the rustle of leaves. I felt a pang of regret, sharp and sudden. One of 1,000 small regrets that now seemed to constitute the bulk of my memories of him. Mr. Gable's office was on the town square, a quaint, slightly tired-looking collection of brick buildings that faced a gazebo and a small war memorial. Oakhaven hadn't changed. It was a town preserved in amber. Mr. Gable himself was exactly as his voice had suggested. Old, kind, with a handshake that was surprisingly firm. He was tall and thin, with a shock of white hair and a suit that looked like it had been tailored in the 1970s. He sat me down in a leather chair that wheezed when I sat in it and handed me a thick manila envelope. "The deed," he said, pushing it across the polished surface of his enormous desk. "And the keys. There are 2. One for the gate, one for the barn itself." He looked at me over the top of his spectacles. "Are you sure you want to go out there yourself, Alara? It's been sitting empty for a long time." "It might be a bit rough," I nodded. "I need to see it." He seemed to understand. He gave me directions, drawing a small, spidery map on the back of a legal pad. It was a few miles out of town, off a dirt road that, he warned, might be washed out in places. As I stood to leave, he put a hand on my arm. "Your father was very proud of you," he said softly. "He talked about you constantly. He wanted you to be happy, but more than that, he wanted you to be strong, independent. I think he knew you'd need this place. One day, the words were meant to be a comfort, but they felt like a burden. A legacy of strength I wasn't sure I possessed." Sparrow Creek Road was more of a suggestion than a road. It was 2 dirt ruts overgrown with weeds, winding through a dense patch of woods. My sedan scraped and bumped along, and twice I had to get out to move a fallen branch. I was beginning to think I'd made a mistake when the woods finally broke, opening onto a wide, fallow field. And there, at the far end of it, silhouetted against the bruised purple of the late afternoon sky, was the barn. It was bigger than I had imagined, and more decrepit. Its wood was the color of driftwood, silvered and weathered by years of sun and rain. The roof sagged in the middle, like the spine of an old horse. A tangle of ivy climbed up one side, a green claw gripping the decaying wood. It wasn't just neglected, it was forgotten, a structure slowly being reclaimed by the earth. A rusty chain-link gate blocked the entrance to the lane that led to it. The lock was stiff with rust, and it took me 10 minutes of wrestling with the old brass key before it finally groaned open. I drove the car up the lane and parked in the tall grass. Getting out, the silence was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the dry field. I walked toward the barn, my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The scale of it was intimidating. The main doors were enormous, big enough to drive a combine through, and held shut by a thick wooden beam. To the side, there was a smaller human-sized door. The lock on this one was newer, less rusted. The second key slid in easily. The door creaked open into darkness. The air that washed over me was thick and heavy, a cocktail of scents: old wood, dry rot, hate, dust, and the faint, musky smell of animals that had long since departed. It was the smell of time itself. For a moment, I just stood there on the threshold, letting my eyes adjust. Sunlight lanced through the gaps in the walls, illuminating swirling galaxies of dust. The interior was vast, the ceiling soaring 3 stories up to a web of rafters where swallows had built their nests. The floor was packed earth, littered with debris, scraps of wood, rusted metal, the detritus of decades. In the center of the vast space, alone, sat a single object: a large, heavy, military-style footlocker. It was painted olive green, with stenciled numbers on the side. It looked completely out of place, a solid, deliberate object in a sea of decay. I walked toward it, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. There was a heavy padlock on its latch. It looked impenetrable. I circled it, running my hand over its cold, metal surface. Why was this here? It was clearly something my father had put here. This was the reason for the newer lock on the door. This was the secret. My heart started to beat a little faster. I looked around the barn, searching for a clue, for something to open it with. In the corner, I saw a pile of old tools leaning against the wall: a pitchfork, a shovel, a heavy-duty crowbar. I picked up the crowbar. It was heavy, solid. I wedged the tip into the hasp of the padlock and pushed. Nothing. I put my whole body into it, grunting with the effort. The metal groaned in protest. I tried again, leveraging all my frustration, all my anger at Mark, at my life, at everything, into that one single point of pressure. With a sudden, violent crack, the hasp snapped. The sound ricocheted around the barn like a gunshot. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, the crowbar still in my hands. Then, slowly, I knelt down and lifted the heavy lid of the footlocker. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Money? Old family heirlooms? But it was none of those things. The first thing I saw was an envelope, resting on top of a neatly folded pile of what looked like canvas. It was a simple white envelope, with a single word written on it in my father's familiar, blocky handwriting. Alara, my breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was the message he'd left for me. My hands trembled as I picked it up. I sat down on the dusty floor of the barn, leaned my back against the cold metal of the footlocker, and opened the letter. My dearest Alara, it began. If you're reading this, it means 2 things. First, that I am gone. And for that, my girl, I am so sorry. I hope it was peaceful, and I hope you know, wherever I am, that my last thought was of you. The second thing it means is that you found your way here, to the old barn, to your place. I know you must have 1,000 questions. Why I kept this place a secret. Why I left it to you in such a strange way. The truth is, I hoped you would never need it. I had to stop reading, my eyes blurring with tears. I hadn't cried in months, not really. I had been too numb, too exhausted. But my father's words, his voice so clear on the page, broke through the dam. I cried for him, for the years I'd lost with him. I cried for my mother, a hazy, gentle memory. I cried for the naive girl who had fallen in love with a man who would one day treat her like a line item on a balance sheet. I cried for the dog I missed and the house that was no longer my home. I sat on the floor of a forgotten barn in the middle of nowhere and let it all pour out of me, the sobs echoing in the empty space around me. After a long time, the tears subsided, leaving me feeling hollowed out and strangely calm. I picked up the letter again and continued to read. I bought this place back after your grandparents died. It was the only piece of their legacy I could afford to save. For me, it was always a reminder of where we came from, of people who worked with their hands, who built things that lasted. I wanted you to have that, a connection to something real, something solid. The world is full of clever men, Elara, who can build empires out of promises and numbers on a screen. I have a feeling you may have already met one. They are charming and brilliant, and they can convince you of anything. But their foundations are built on sand. I wanted you to have a foundation of rock, a place to stand. He had known. Somehow, he had known the kind of man I would fall for, the kind of man who had undone me. It was a father's intuition, a premonition that reached across the years. I set the trust to transfer on your 28th birthday for a reason. I figure by then, you'd be old enough to know your own mind, to have made a few mistakes, and hopefully, to have learned from them. You'd be old enough to understand what this place really is. It is an investment, Elara. Don't let some real estate agent convince you to sell it for a quick profit. It's an inheritance of a different kind. I looked back into the footlocker. Beneath where the letter had been was a thick, folded bundle of oilcloth. I carefully lifted it out. It was heavy. I unfolded it on the floor. Inside were tools. Not farm tools, but something else entirely. Chisels of all sizes, their wooden handles worn smooth with use. Mallets. Hand planes. A beautiful, brass-backed dovetail saw. They were woodworking tools, old and of incredible quality. Tucked in with them was a thick, leather-bound sketchbook. I opened it. It was filled with my father's drawings. Not just idle doodles, but intricate, detailed designs for furniture. Chairs, tables, cabinets. Each one was drawn with a draftsman's precision, but with an artist's soul. Notes were scribbled in the margins, calculations about joinery, thoughts on the grain of a particular wood. I had never known this. He had never shown me this. My father, the quiet history teacher, had been a master craftsman, a secret artist. I flipped through the pages, my mind reeling. The designs were beautiful, a mix of clean, modern lines and traditional, solid construction. And then I saw it. On the last few pages, a series of designs for a child's cradle. It was simple, elegant, with carved birds on a headboard. In the corner of the page, in his familiar script, was a note. For Elara, someday, he had dreamed of being a grandfather. A fresh wave of grief washed over me. But this time, it was different. It was mingled with a sense of wonder. I was discovering a whole new side to the man I thought I knew so well. The letter had one final paragraph. These were my father's tools and his father's before him. Our family didn't have much, but we knew how to make things. I learned from him in this very barn before I went off to college and became a respectable teacher. I put these tools away, thinking that life was behind me. But the knowledge is still there in the wood and the steel. And it's in you, too. I taught you, remember? The little birdhouse we built when you were 8? The wobbly bookshelf for your college dorm? You have the hands for it. You have the eye. This barn, these tools, this knowledge, this is your real inheritance, Elara. It's not much, but it's real. It's a way to build a new life, not with numbers and promises, but with your own 2 hands. What you do with it is up to you. Just know that I believe in you. Always. All my love, Dad. I put the letter down, my hands shaking. A place to stand. A way to build a new life. He hadn't just left me a derelict barn and some old tools. He had left me a blueprint. A way out. A second chance that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with purpose. I looked around the vast, decaying space. It wasn't an asset to be liquidated. It was a workshop waiting to be reborn. It was a sanctuary. It was home. The choice Mr. Gable had laid out for me, sell the land, take the money, seemed like a distant echo from another life. It was the sensible path, Mark's path. My father had offered me a different one, a harder one, a path covered in sawdust and sweat, a path that led back to myself. And in that moment, sitting on the dusty floor, surrounded by the ghosts of my ancestors and the last, loving words of my father, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was something close. It was hope, a tiny, resilient seed planted in the barren landscape of my heart. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shafts of light through the gaps in the barn walls. For the first time, they didn't look like signs of decay. They looked like promises. Listen, if you've made it this far into my story, thank you. It means a lot. This part, the part where everything has been stripped away and you're left with a choice you didn't even know you had, it's a terrifying place to be. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you're there right now. If you are, I just want you to know that you're not alone. This community we're building here is for people who get it. If this is hitting home for you, maybe leave a comment and just say hello. Let us know you're here. Your story matters. Now, let's get back to what happened next, because finding the tools was just the beginning. The real work was about to start. I spent the night in my car. I had nowhere else to go, and the thought of leaving the barn, even for a few hours, felt wrong. It felt like abandoning a post. I leaned the seat back, using a sweatshirt as a pillow, and watched the stars appear through the dusty windshield, brighter and more numerous than I had ever seen them in the city. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind was a whirlwind of my father's words, the images from his sketchbook, the solid, comforting weight of the old tools. It was too much to process. I was grieving a man I thought I knew, while simultaneously meeting him for the very first time. I felt a profound sense of loss, but also a strange and powerful sense of connection. He had seen me. He had seen my future, my potential weaknesses, and had laid this path for me, a secret escape route from a life he prayed I would never have to live. The next morning, I woke up stiff and cold, dew coating the windows of the car. The first light of dawn was painting the field in shades of pink and orange. I got out of the car and walked back to the barn. In the morning light, it looked less like a ruin and more like a promise. The task ahead was monumental. The place was a wreck. The roof had holes, the floor was uneven, and there was no electricity or running water. It was a shell, but for the first time, I could see beyond the decay. I could see the workshop my father had described. I could see benches lining the walls, racks of wood, the glint of sharpened steel. I could see a life. My first step was practical. I drove back into Oakhaven. The town was just waking up, a single bakery open, its windows glowing with warmth. I bought a coffee and a bag of pastries and sat in my car on the town square, making a list on the back of a napkin. I needed cleaning supplies, heavy-duty gloves, tarps for the roof, a generator. The list grew longer and longer, and with each item, a little thrill of panic shot through me. The small amount of cash I had in my bank account, the dregs of my savings that Mark hadn't been able to touch, would be gone in a matter of days. This was a gamble, a huge, terrifying leap of faith based on a letter and a box of old tools. I started at the local hardware store. It was a place out of time, with wooden floors that creaked and aisles packed to the ceiling with everything from tractor parts to canning jars. The man behind the counter was old and wiry, with a suspicious squint. "Help you," he grunted. I showed him my list. He looked at it, then at me, taking in my city clothes and my beat-up sedan. His squint deepened. "You're not from around here." It was a statement, not a question. "No," I said. "I'm staying out at the old Vance place, the barn on Sparrow Creek Road." His expression changed instantly. The squint vanished, replaced by a look of surprised recognition. "Vance? You're Danny Vance's girl?" "Alara." I was stunned. "You knew my father?" He let out a short laugh. "Knew him? Of course I knew him. Went all through school with him. I'm Tom Henderson." He stuck out a calloused hand. "Heard you were back in town. Small towns. You know," he looked at my list again, a new understanding in his eyes. "So you're fixing up the old place." Danny always loved that barn. Used to go out there and just sit. Said it was the only place he could think straight. Tom became my first ally. He walked me through the store, pointing out the best tools for the job, giving me a contractor's discount without me even asking. He told me stories about my father, stories about their teenage misadventures, about how my dad was always the quiet, thoughtful one, the one who would rather be reading a book or tinkering with something in the garage than playing football. He was a good man, your dad, Tom said as he loaded a small, used generator into the trunk of my car. Had a tough run of it after your mom passed. But he never complained. Just put his head down and did what he had to do for you. That day, I started the real work. I put on old jeans and a t-shirt and tied my hair back. I propped the big barn doors open to let in the light and air and began the monumental task of cleaning. I swept away decades of dust and debris. I pulled down old, rotting nests. I shoveled out piles of hardened dirt and God knows what else. It was back-breaking, filthy work. By the end of the day, I was covered in sweat and grime, my muscles screaming in protest. But as I stood in the middle of a slightly cleaner, slightly less chaotic space, I felt a satisfaction so deep and pure it was almost startling. I hadn't created anything yet, but I had made a space for creation. I had cleared the ground. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. I would wake up with the sun, work until I was exhausted, and then drive back to town to a small, cheap motel room I'd rented by the week. I patched the roof with heavy tarps, a temporary but effective fix. I ran extension cords from the generator to power a set of work lights. I built a rough but sturdy workbench out of reclaimed lumber I found in a corner of the barn. Every small victory felt like a monumental achievement. I was slowly, painstakingly carving out a space for myself, both literally and figuratively. My phone rang one afternoon as I was trying to level the packed earth floor in one corner. It was a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Hello. The voice on the other end was slick and familiar. It was Mark's lawyer. My blood ran cold. Ms. Vance, he said, his voice oozing a false politeness that set my teeth on edge. I'm calling on behalf of my client. It has come to our attention that you have recently come into possession of a small property. An inheritance, I believe. How did they know? I felt a surge of panic. Had they been watching me? Spying on me? That's none of your business, I said, my voice tighter than I wanted. He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. Actually, under the terms of your divorce settlement, any undisclosed assets are subject to review. We contend that this property, or at least its value, should have been part of the marital estate. My client is prepared to be reasonable. We will offer you a settlement for your half of its assessed value, minus legal fees, of course. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He had taken everything, and now he was coming back for the crumbs. The one thing that was mine. The old me, the me from a month ago, would have crumbled. I would have been terrified, intimidated by the legal jargon and the veiled threats. But standing there in the barn, covered in dirt, my hands raw from physical labor, I felt a new kind of strength. A strength that came from building something, not just acquiring it. Let me be very clear, I said, my voice low and steady. This property was never part of our marital estate. It was held in a trust that I had no knowledge of and no access to. It is mine. It was left to me by my father, and it is not for sale. Ms. Vance, I would advise you to reconsider, he said, his tone hardening. We are prepared to litigate this. It will be expensive and time-consuming for you. The threat hung in the air. He knew I had no money for a legal battle. He was trying to bully me into submission. Tell Mark, I said, the words coming out clear and cold as ice, that he can't have it. He has taken everything else. He will not take this. This is my place to stand. Do you understand? I hung up before he could reply. My hand was shaking, but not from fear. It was from rage. Apure, cleansinganja. He had underestimated me. He had assumed I was still the same broken, compliant woman who had signed away her life in a conference room. He was wrong. The call lit a fire under me. My work took on a new urgency. This wasn't just about honoring my father's memory anymore. It was about fighting for my future. It was about proving to myself and to the ghost of my marriage that I could not be erased. I started spending time with the tools, cleaning the rust from them, sharpening the blades, feeling their balance in my hands. I read through my father's sketchbook every night, studying his designs, absorbing his techniques. I bought books on woodworking, devouring them late into the night in my motel room. I decided to start with something small, a project from my father's notes, a simple, three-legged stool. The design was elegant, almost sculptural. I bought a piece of local oak from a sawmill Tom told me about. The first few days were a disaster. My cuts were uneven. My joints didn't fit. I grew frustrated, wanting to throw the wood across the barn. But I remember my father's patience, the quiet way he would sand a piece of wood for hours until it was perfectly smooth. I slowed down. I focused on the process, not the result. I learned to read the grain of the wood, to listen to the sound of a sharp plane slicing through it. Slowly, painstakingly, the stool began to take shape. I cut the mortise and tenon joints by hand, just as my father's notes instructed. I shaped the legs with a spoke of Chauvet, the curls of wood falling to the floor like scented ribbons. I sanded it for hours until the surface felt like silk. And when I finally assembled it, when the last joint slid snugly into place, I felt a surge of pride so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. It was wobbly. It was imperfect, but I had made it. I had taken a piece of rough lumber and, with my own two hands and my father's legacy, I had turned it into something useful and beautiful. I had built something that would last. That little stool was a turning point. It was proof of concept, proof that my father was right. I could do this. I started on another project, a small side table from a sketchbook. This one went more smoothly. I was learning. I was growing. I found a deep, meditative peace in the work, in the focus and precision it required. The noise in my head, the constant loop of regret and failure, quieted. It was replaced by the scrape of the saw, the tap of the mallet, the scent of fresh-cut oak. One evening, Mr. Gable called me. "Alara," he said, his voice grave, "I received a letter from your ex-husband's attorney. They're formally challenging your ownership of the property." I felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in my stomach, but I pushed it down. "What can we do?" I asked. "Well," he said, a slight smile in his voice, "I've been doing some reading. Your father was a clever man. The trust he set up was what we call a bare trust. He was merely the legal owner, holding it for you, the beneficiary. It was never his asset to give, and since you had no knowledge of it, it was never a marital asset to be disclosed. They have no case, Alara. They're just trying to scare you. It's a bluff." The relief was so immense I had to sit down. "What do we do?" I asked again. "We call their bluff," he said simply. "I'll write them a letter, citing the relevant precedents. I don't think you'll be hearing from them again. By the way, there's no charge for this. Consider it a professional courtesy." For Danny, I hung up the phone, a slow smile spreading across my face. I looked at the table I was finishing, its surface gleaming under the work lights. I had a lawyer in my corner. I had a community, however small. I had my father's tools in my own two hands. And I had a foundation of rock. Let them come, I thought. I was ready. As the weeks turned into a couple of months, the barn transformed. So did I. I had cleared out all the junk, built more workbenches, and organized my father's tools on a wall rack where I could see them all. The space was no longer a ruin. It was a sanctuary of sawdust and potential. I had found my rhythm. I was working my way through my father's sketchbook, recreating his designs, learning his craft. Each piece was better than the last. I was sleeping in the barn now, on a cot in a corner I'd walled off and insulated. It was rustic, but it was mine. I would wake up each morning to the smell of wood and the first light filtering through the cracks in the walls, and I would feel a sense of peace I'd never known. My money was almost gone. The reality of my situation was beginning to set in. This couldn't just be a hobby, a form of therapy. It had to be a life. It had to be a business. The thought was terrifying. I was a woodworker, not an entrepreneur. I didn't know the first thing about selling furniture, but I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't return to the city, to a life of cubicles and spreadsheets. Not after this. Not after tasting this kind of freedom, this kind of tangible creation. I loaded my first finished pieces, the wobbly stool, the side table, and a small, elegant bookshelf, into the back of my car and drove into town. There was a small farmer's market on the square every Saturday. I paid the $20 fee for a spot, set up a card table, and arranged my furniture on a patch of grass. I felt horribly exposed, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. People walked by, glancing at my work. Most just smiled and moved on. A few stopped, ran their hands over the smooth wood, and complimented my craftsmanship. But no one bought anything. As the day wore on, my optimism began to fade. The fear began to take over. Maybe this was all a foolish dream. Maybe I had just been hiding from the real world in my father's barn. By late afternoon, I was ready to pack up, defeated. Then, an older woman with kind eyes and a warm smile stopped at my table. She spent a long time looking at the bookshelf, running her fingers along the dovetail joints. "This is beautiful work," she said. "Did you make this yourself?" I nodded, unable to speak. "It reminds me of the furniture my father used to make," she continued. "He was a cabinet maker. You don't see this kind of quality anymore. Everything is particle board and veneer." She looked at the price tag I'd sheepishly written on a piece of cardboard. "You're not charging enough," she said with a smile. "I'll take it." I was so stunned, I could barely process the transaction. She paid me in cash, crisp $100 bills that felt unreal in my hand. As I helped her load the bookshelf into her car, she turned to me. "Keep doing this," she said. "You have a gift. People will recognize it." Her words and her faith were like water on parched earth. It was only one sale, but it was enough. It was a sign, a confirmation that my father's legacy and my new life had value in the world. That one sale gave me the courage to keep going. I went back to the market the next week and the next. I sold the side table. I got a commission to build a custom coffee table. Word began to spread through the small town. "Did you hear about Danny Vance's girl? She's a woodworker. Does amazing work." Just like the old-timers, people started seeking me out, driving down the bumpy dirt road to my barn workshop. They weren't just customers, they were neighbors. They brought me casseroles and fresh vegetables from their gardens. They shared stories about my father and mother, painting a richer, more complete picture of the people I had only known through the lens of a child. I was no longer an outsider, a refugee from the city. I was becoming part of the fabric of this place. I was putting down roots. One day, I found something else in the barn. I was clearing out a final, cluttered corner, a space I had avoided because it was filled with old, rotting sacks of grain. As I moved them, I noticed a section of the floorboards looked different. They were newer, less worn. Curious, I pried one up with a crowbar. Beneath it was a small, hollow space. And inside that space was a metal box. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid, my heart thumping. It wasn't filled with tools or sketchbooks. It was filled with cash. Bundles of old, soft bills, neatly wrapped in twine. And on top, another letter. This one was short. "Alara," it read. "This is the seed money. It's not much, but it's what I managed to save over the years, a little from every paycheck. I sold your mother's old car, things like that. It's for you to buy a proper saw, to run electricity to the barn, to get started right. I didn't give it to you at first, because I needed you to choose this life for the right reasons. Not for the money, but for the work, for the peace it can bring. If you found this, it means you've chosen it. You've done the hard work. Now, build your future. I'm so proud of you. Love, Dad." The tears came again, but this time, they were tears of gratitude. He had thought of everything. He had not only given me the tools and the place, but the means to truly make it real. He had trusted me to find my own way to earn this final gift. It was the last piece of the puzzle, the final confirmation that I was on the right path. The next year was one of transformation. I had a proper electrical line run to the barn. I bought a professional table saw and a planer. I insulated the walls and installed a wood stove, making the space a warm, functional workshop year-round. I launched a simple website, and orders started coming in from outside Oak Haven. I was building a business, a reputation. I was building a life, one piece of furniture at a time. I was no longer Alara Vance, the divorced woman who had lost everything. I was Alara Vance, the furniture maker, a creator, a builder. I never heard from Mark or his lawyer again. Their bluff had been called, their power over me broken. The house with the climbing roses, the life I had mourned so deeply, now felt like a photograph of a stranger. It was a part of my story, a painful but necessary chapter that had led me here, to this barn, to this life that was so much more real and fulfilling than anything I had known before. My inheritance wasn't just a piece of property or a box of tools or a stash of cash. It was the knowledge that my foundation was not built on sand. It was built on the love of a father, the legacy of my ancestors, and the strength of my own two hands. It was built on rock. And, standing in my workshop, the scent of sawdust in the air, the hum of the machinery, a comforting song, I finally understood what my father meant. I had found my place to stand. And from here, I could build anything. This journey, from losing everything to rebuilding a life from scratch, it taught me something profound about what inheritance really means. It's not always about the money or the property. Sometimes the most valuable things we're given are the hidden strengths, the forgotten skills, the second chances we didn't even know we had. It's about finding that foundation inside yourself. If my story has resonated with you, if you've ever had to dig deep to find your own place to stand, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe and become part of this community. And please, share a piece of your own story in the comments below. What's the inheritance, tangible or intangible, that helped you rebuild? I read every single one, and I believe, with all my heart, that our stories are how we help each other build a better future. Thank you for listening.